So in this video, we're talking about the exposure triangle and what that actually means. Okay, so the exposure triangle is very easy to understand actually. The first part of the exposure triangle is shutter speed, and then we move on to aperture, and then ISO. These aren't specifically in any order because we want to balance them out. And the order that you choose these is pretty much decided on personal taste, preference, and application. So we've learned about what each side of the exposure triangle means. What do we do now? And how do we put this into context? So imagine there's a scale that is kind of shaped like a triangle, which I'm not sure if that exists or not. But on one side is shutter speed, one side aperture, and the third ISO. Our goal is to make that scale sit flat and balanced, allowing us to have the proper exposure. So in order to balance this light, we have to understand why we're trying to balance it and what the context is. So if we want an image with a very shallow depth of field, we want to start with that side of the scale. Let's set that to f2.8 or lower. And then we'll go to the next side of the scale. What's the next most important thing for us in this context? Well, in my case, let's just say I want to make sure I capture motion without having to worry about my shot being in focus as much. So I want to have a higher shutter speed. So I'll go ahead and set that to where I want it. Then I'll move on to ISO. ISO is my last thing in my scale on this particular shoot. I'll go ahead and get it as close to the exposure that I want as possible. And if the ISO goes higher than I actually desire, which I try to stay somewhere between 100 and 600 if I'm outside. If I can't get it within that range, I'll go ahead and compromise on either my shutter speed. Maybe I can drag that down a little bit because it's the second most important thing in my shot on this particular shoot. Maybe I don't need as shallow of a depth of field as I thought. So I can go ahead and darken the exposure a little bit, brighten it based on where I was before. The whole point is we want to make that scale on your light meter being that scale, wanting to make it balance out properly and get a proper exposure, meanwhile getting the creative taste that we want. So there isn't a secret formula to this. The biggest thing is start with what your creative preference is and then balance everything else out accordingly. Or if you're in a specific type of situation, maybe it's not creative preference, but technical preference. Anyway, I hope that helps with you balancing out your exposure and makes a little bit more sense of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed.